Competitive forces analysis. Csca. Define strategic risk. Strategic risk is the risk that an organization's business strategy becomes ineffective, misaligned, or unable to achieve its objectives due to changes in internal or external conditions. It arises when assumptions underlying the strategy prove incorrect or when the environment shifts in ways not anticipated during planning. Strategic risk differs from operational or financial risk because it directly affects long-term positioning, competitive advantage, and value creation. Strategic risk often stems from industry disruption, technological change, evolving customer preferences, regulatory shifts, or competitive dynamics. Poor market entry decisions, over-reliance on declining products, or failure to innovate may expose firms to significant strategic threats. Inadequate environmental scanning or weak competitive intelligence increases the likelihood of misalignment between strategy and reality. Effective management of strategic risk requires continuous monitoring, scenario analysis, and adaptive planning. Organizations must reassess assumptions, evaluate competitive forces, and incorporate feedback loops into the strategic management process. By proactively identifying emerging threats and opportunities, firms can adjust their strategies before risks materially damage performance or erode competitive advantage. Csca. Prepare a competitive forces analysis using Porter's 5 forces model to identify and assess strategic risks. Preparing a Porter's 5 forces analysis involves systematically evaluating the threat of new entrants, bargaining power of suppliers, bargaining power of buyers, threat of substitutes, and rivalry among existing competitors. Each force is assessed in terms of strength and its impact on profitability. Strong forces typically increase competitive pressure and compress margins, signaling higher strategic risk for firms operating in the industry. To identify strategic risks, analysts must determine which forces pose the greatest threat to the organization's business model. For example, high buyer power may expose a firm to price pressure, while strong substitute threats may undermine demand stability. Intense rivalry may result in price wars or overcapacity. Assessing these forces collectively provides a structured view of vulnerabilities within the competitive environment. The analysis should integrate industry-level assessment with firm-specific positioning. A company with strong differentiation or cost advantages may face lower effective risk even in a competitive industry. Conversely, weak positioning amplifies exposure to structural pressures. The completed 5 forces analysis highlights areas requiring defensive strategies, differentiation efforts, cost improvements, or strategic repositioning to mitigate risk. Csca. Evaluate a company's strategy in terms of strategic risk, i.e., misalignment with market and industry conditions. Evaluating strategy for strategic risk requires examining whether the firm's value proposition, cost structure, and competitive positioning align with industry conditions. If a company pursues premium pricing in a highly price-sensitive, commoditized market, misalignment exists. Similarly, aggressive expansion during declining industry demand may indicate strategic overreach. Comparing strategic objectives with life cycle stage, competitive intensity, and macroeconomic trends reveals potential weaknesses. Analysts should assess whether the strategy adequately addresses key industry forces and environmental risks. For example, ignoring substitute threats, underestimating new entrant risk, or failing to respond to technological change increases vulnerability. A strategy heavily dependent on outdated assumptions or static market conditions signals elevated strategic risk. Finally, evaluation involves reviewing financial performance indicators, investment patterns, and risk exposure relative to competitors. Declining margins, rising costs, or shrinking market share may reflect strategic misalignment. Effective evaluation integrates competitive intelligence, industry analysis, and financial assessment to determine whether strategy supports sustainable competitive advantage or requires adjustment to reduce long-term risk. Csca. Define industry dissonance. Industry dissonance occurs when there is a misalignment between a company's strategy and the evolving conditions of its industry environment. It arises when management continues to operate under outdated assumptions despite shifts in competitive forces, customer preferences, technological innovation, or regulatory changes. As a result, the organization's value proposition, cost structure, or growth strategy no longer matches market realities, increasing exposure to strategic risk and performance decline. Industry dissonance often develops gradually due to complacency, success inertia, or failure to monitor environmental signals. Companies that dominate mature markets may ignore disruptive technologies or emerging competitors. Over time, the gap between strategy and external conditions widens, eroding competitiveness and financial performance. Warning signs may include declining market share, shrinking margins, or reduced customer loyalty. Addressing industry dissonance requires continuous environmental scanning, competitive intelligence, and adaptive strategy formulation. Organizations must regularly reassess industry life cycle stages, competitive forces, and macroeconomic trends. By proactively identifying shifts and adjusting strategic direction, firms can restore alignment and maintain sustainable competitive advantage in dynamic markets. Csca. Prioritize strategic risks in terms of magnitude, probability, and linkage to strategy. Prioritizing strategic risks involves evaluating the magnitude of potential impact on organizational objectives. Magnitude considers financial loss, reputational damage, operational disruption, or long-term competitive harm. High-impact risks, such as technological obsolescence or regulatory prohibition, require greater attention than risks with minimal strategic consequences. Quantitative tools such as scenario modeling or stress testing may assist in estimating potential outcomes. The probability of occurrence must also be assessed to determine overall risk exposure. Some risks may have high impact but low likelihood, while others may be moderate but highly probable. Evaluating probability involves analyzing historical trends, industry forecasts, and competitive intelligence. Combining magnitude and probability helps classify risks into high, medium, or low priority categories for strategic focus. Strategic risks should also be prioritized based on their direct linkage to core strategy and competitive positioning. Risks threatening key revenue streams, value propositions, or cost advantages deserve higher priority than peripheral concerns. Effective prioritization integrates enterprise risk management with strategic planning, ensuring that resources are allocated to mitigate the most critical vulnerabilities facing the organization. Csca discuss similarities and differences of competitive analysis between for-profit and non-profit organizations and among small, medium, and large organizations. Both for-profit and non-profit organizations use competitive analysis to understand their operating environments, stakeholder expectations, and resource constraints. Each must assess industry forces, substitute services, funding sources, and competitive positioning. However, for-profit firms emphasize profitability, market share, and shareholder value, while non-profits focus on mission fulfillment, social impact, and donor relationships. Performance metrics differ, but the analytical framework, environmental scanning, competitor assessment, and strategic positioning remains conceptually similar. Differences also exist in revenue models and stakeholder dynamics. For-profit firms rely primarily on customer sales, while non-profits depend on donations, grants, and public funding. Consequently, non-profits may face competition for funding rather than customers alone. Regulatory oversight and board governance structures may also differ, influencing how competitive analysis informs strategy and accountability. Among small, medium, and large organizations, the core principles of competitive analysis remain consistent, but the degree of formalization varies. Large firms typically employ structured analytical frameworks, dedicated research teams, and advanced modeling tools. Small firms may rely on informal observation and managerial intuition due to resource constraints. Medium-sized firms balance growing complexity with limited analytical capacity. Regardless of size or sector, effective competitive analysis supports strategic alignment and long-term sustainability.